Hey everybody, TacticAngel here, back on the PlayStation 4 to take a look at another premium ship in World of Warships Legends. This time we'll be taking a look at the USS Massachusetts, the Tier 7 American premium battleship. First, we'll take a look at the ship's history, then we'll jump into some analysis, your commander choices, her stats, and finally we'll finish off with a bit of gameplay. If you want to skip around at all, you should see some time codes down in the description to help you out. The USS Massachusetts was the third ship in a series of 4 ships in the South Dakota class of fast battleships. Fast is more a note of the departure from the 21-knot standard battleship classes that preceded the North Carolina class, with the South Dakota being the follow-on to that ship design. Not that she possessed unusual speed for battleships built during this time. Her placement in history would mean that she would be the second to last battleship America would produce within treaty limits. She was laid down in July 1939 and launched in September 1941. She was not commissioned into service by December 7th, so it's no surprise that she was not present at Pearl Harbor. But to say that she was not affected by the events there would be a mistake, because the loss of 5 battleships meant that she needed to be rushed into service. She was commissioned into the fleet in May 1942, just 6 months after the attack at Pearl, and by October 1942, she was headed across the Atlantic as the flagship for Admiral Hewitt, overseeing the invasion of North Africa, foregoing much of the normal shakedown and training a battleship usually sees before facing an enemy. Instead, the Massachusetts would get a trial by fire in the appropriately named Operation Torch. Here she would take part in the Battle of Casablanca, where the French fleet sortied against the Allies and the incomplete battleship Jean Bart provided artillery support. The Massachusetts quickly dissuaded the Jean Bart's participation with 5 hits in 9 salvos, assuring she only shot a total of 8 of her 15-inch shells, and to no great effect. She then went on to assist in the sinking of 2 French destroyers whose name you can see on the screen, so let the guessing game begin there. By the end of the battle, Massachusetts had also sent 2 other merchant ships to the bottom, as well as a floating dry dock, and did plenty of damage to the port itself. During the battle, she was struck multiple times, but suffered only superficial damage. Following Operation Torch, the Massachusetts returned to Boston for repair, refit, and resupply, until February 1943, when it was time for her to transfer through the Panama Canal into the Pacific Theater, where she would spend the remainder of the war. Most of this time would be dominated by bombardment missions, escort duties, and a series of near misses when it came to major fleet engagements. Her first stint here included service around New Guinea, the Solomons, and the invasion of the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, then the Marshall Islands in January 1944, and support of air raids against Truk in February. She returned to the United States, this time to Bremerton, Washington, for rest, repair, and replacement of her 16-inch guns, which were well worn by May 1944. But she was back at sea in September for the invasion of the Palau Islands and the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Unfortunately, she was part of Task Force 34 under the legendary Vice Admiral Willis Lee, which had been detached to hunt down a second Japanese fleet expected to be making a flanking maneuver, which turned out to be a wild goose chase. Only that the goose didn't exist, and the battleships weren't able to make it back into the combat area in order to engage the Japanese center force. She was then part of Halsey's fleet that was struck by Typhoon Cobra, but considering her size and toughness, she suffered relatively little damage from the infamous storm. She provided shore bombardment for the invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa before inching her way up to Japan itself, with bombardment missions against Japanese industry in Hamamatsu, alongside King George V, and Kamaishi, where Massachusetts was accompanied by her sister ship, Alabama. The Big Mammy, as she was called by her crew, returned to the United States following the war for one last refit before operating out of California for about a year. In March 1947, she was decommissioned and placed into the reserve fleet. Over the next decade, the U.S. Navy looked at what they wanted to do with the 4 South Dakota-class battleships, including converting them into guided missile battleships, but estimates to convert each of these ships was around $40 million each, which sounds affordable in today's numbers, but at that price, and at that time, you could just build a brand new, purpose-built ship. Ultimately, in 1962, she was stricken from the Naval Registry and ordered for scrap. However, the Big Mammy had a tight-knit crew that had met annually since her decommissioning, and along with the famous help of school children of the state, Massachusetts was able to purchase the ship to keep as the centerpiece of what would come to be known as Battleship Cove, one of the best places in the United States for ship enthusiasts to visit. In addition to BB-59, it also is home to the USS Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., a Gearing-class destroyer named for a fallen U.S. aviator and the older brother of JFK, the future American president. The USS Lionfish, a Balao-class submarine, the Hidden Sea, an East German Tarantul-class corvette, as well as a few PT boats, landing craft, and even a few helicopters and planes. In total, the Massachusetts earned 11 battle stars, and an honor not exactly conferred with medals or ribbons. In her engagement with the Jean Bart, she fired what was probably the first 16-inch shells fired by the U.S. Navy during World War II, and she is also credited with firing the last 16-inch shells at the Japanese home islands nearly 3 years later. Probably even more importantly, though, during her service, no member of her crew was killed in combat with the enemy. The Massachusetts enters the game as the second of the South Dakota-class battleships in the game, after the Alabama. And most of the things that you can say about the Alabama, you can also say about the Massachusetts. They do have some differences, most of which are rounding errors in your average game, so you'd probably be forgiven if you say these two ships play in a similar manner. That said, the Massachusetts has some unique advantages compared to the Alabama, and in general versus other Tier 7 battleships. The Massachusetts, for one, has a more robust health pool than the Alabama, which may help you hang in there just a little bit longer. Don't confuse this with having a lot of health though. Alabama is simply a bit below average, and the Massachusetts is pretty much where the average is right now. The Massachusetts also has very long-ranged secondaries. Whether these are simply psychological deterrents or something useful will come down to your equipment and commander choices, but in fighting against these, I can tell you, in a destroyer, they do make you think twice. And of course, she is highly maneuverable for a 16-inch battleship, which is a really neat trick, even if we now have 3 of those in the game right now. Unfortunately, unless you want to invest in your secondary performance, you're not likely to get much out of these other than the psychological effect. And even if you do, their usefulness against the battleships you'll be facing here is basically that you look cooler than they do, and maybe you set 1 or 2 extra fires. Just like the Alabama, you're also more vulnerable than the Iowa to large caliber shells through the bow of your ship. This means, though you're advertised as a brawler, you're really more of a medium-range battleship that can push an objective more than a true brawler who can get in there and mix it up at extremely close ranges. And that is not helped at all by having the worst turret traverse of any battleship at the tier. It's actually really hard to overstate how crippling this is for a brawling battleship, because if you wanted to say that's the single most important stat, you might be wrong. But I don't know that there's any agreement on what would be more important. People who are likely to enjoy the Massachusetts are players who enjoy ships like the Iowa and want the ability to actually push objectives with some confidence rather than sitting in the back doing the Iowa thing. The ship can basically do the same thing the Alabama does, and arguably even do it better than the Alabama, with trades in the stats that are generally favorable to the Massachusetts, if only slightly, and mostly at medium range. Strangely, at short range, the Alabama in many ways can outperform her sister, who is supposed to be the brawler in the family. That said, players familiar with the Massachusetts from PC should be warned that she's a lot less fun in Legends. And when it comes to building for secondaries and expecting that to be a good idea in the current game, I'm afraid she's profoundly disappointing. Where she is a good pickup is for folks who might want to get something like the Alabama, who don't have 750,000 global XP, for the collectors out there, obviously, and for people who really just prefer the South Dakota class battleship in this slick, historically accurate Measure 32 Design 1D camouflage, as opposed to the Alabama's two-tone and also highly accurate Measure 22 camo. When looking for commanders on the Massachusetts, you're probably going to want to at least consider using someone meant to improve the performance of your secondaries, which means there's a good chance you'll look at Willis Lee. In reality, the best reason to use Lee is probably for survivability, because limiting the number of fires on your ship and increasing the effectiveness and the number of heals that you have is a lot more useful than anything that you can do for your secondaries. That said, if you want to try to play the Massachusetts in the traditional way, I would definitely choose Porcupine, since that is probably the most useful secondary skill in the game, and skip Properly Meticulous because it's not only a bad ability overall, but it's clearly not worth throwing away 10 or 20,000 potential hit points. The real problem with Lee is that using him will limit your ability to correct some of the not incredible accuracy the Massachusetts has to basically what equipment you choose, namely the artillery plotting room or a spotter plane, and realistically, if you take Porcupine, your turret traverse is probably going to have to be what it is, and that is a very real handicap for a brawling battleship. You can try to fix this with your inspirations, namely Kedroff or Madden, but that ties up one of your commanders for a playstyle that is really unlikely to be helpful in any other ship in Legends, and probably one of the largest problems with the commander system we have right now overall. The other dedicated battleship commander is, of course, Bill Sims. Sims offers you the best opportunity to fix the Massachusetts accuracy and turret traverse problem. Along the way, you can pick up added range and some extra main battery damage. Unfortunately, even if you are a fast battleship historically, these choices are going to have a significant impact on the maneuverability of your ship, and to me that kind of just feels like a waste of a South Dakota. But if you're an Iowa player who wants nothing more in life than to be less of a torpedo magnet so you can more confidently move forward, then this still may be a good commander choice for you. And while I personally love Dewey on cruisers and certain destroyers, you know the one, the advantages that he offers to a ship like the Massachusetts are pretty limited. In fact, the only real nice thing you can say about him is that Burn It Down will improve secondary fire chances. Granted, it will only increase your fire chance from 5% to 7%, and your enemies are going to shrug off about 50% of potential fires you start, just based on fire resistances. So in the game where you hit 100 times with secondaries, that's probably right around 1 extra fire on average. And I don't really think that's enough of a reason to use him, particularly since you're probably going to miss a lot of extra shots, unless you take the secondary battery consumable. Also, as usual, Dewey offers you access to Fully Packed, which is less useful right now thanks to Will to Rebuild being as beefy as it is, but a third secondary booster could occasionally come in handy. Faster consumables could be useful always, but as you'd expect on any base commander, most of the other choices here are pretty underwhelming. Jumping into stats, we'll be looking at the stats of the Massachusetts, largely against the Alabama and Iowa, but I'll also try to work in where she falls versus other Tier 7 battleships in the game where appropriate. With 66,300 hit points, you have a remarkably average amount of HP, which puts you about 3,000 above the Alabama and a little more than 3,000 below the Iowa. This 46% torpedo reduction is 3% worse than Alabama, which is not really a big deal here, and she is still comfortably the second most protected battleship versus torpedoes at the tier, and still in the top 5 most resilient battleships in the game versus those metal fish. Her armor scheme is not meaningfully different than the Alabama, though her hitbox seems to differ a little bit. You do have a 32mm bow, but the shape of it makes it a lot less bouncy than you'll find on the Iowa, and it does mean that you have to be somewhat careful about getting too close to other battleships. Your Citadel is below the waterline, which works out to you being most vulnerable at medium ranges because the 32mm deck armor and the slope of the interior belt should offer you slightly better protection against plunging fire. That said, the Massachusetts is very vulnerable from behind thanks to the poorly armored stern and minimal armor protection your Citadel has at that angle, so it is definitely not ideal for kiting. In the artillery department, the Massachusetts has 9 16-inch guns arranged in 3 turrets, which is obviously the same deal you'll be looking at on both the Iowa and Alabama. The reload speed, fire chance, and shell damage on the 3 American ships is also exactly the same. Where they differ is both the Alabama and Iowa have longer artillery ranges, In spite of what the Alabama's statistics say, she has average range for the tier, which puts the Massachusetts about 200 meters below average. It's not a big deal, though the Iowa has a very impressive 17.7 here. The Alabama makes up for this by having a 5-second better turret traverse, while the Massachusetts suffers the joint worst battleship turret traverse alongside the Iowa and a handful of other ships, with 45-second turret traverse. As far as the reload you see here, the overview screen says this is better than average. This is kind of a matter of opinion. In my opinion, that opinion is wrong. Among 16-inch guns, Americans and Japanese generally reload at 30 seconds. Russians reload at 33, so there's where it's a little bit faster, but the average reload is 28 seconds at the tier, so I'd probably call this fairly average. Those aren't the only guns on the ship though, and the Massachusetts, like the Iowa and Alabama, has 5 twin 5-inch dual-purpose guns on each side of the ship. Rather than ranging out to the standard 5 kilometers though, they have an impressive 7-kilometer range. This gives the Massachusetts the best secondary range of any Tier 7 ship that isn't named Bismarck. Unfortunately, the fire chance is pretty disappointing at just 5%, and the rate of fire isn't all that impressive either. Even if you get all your guns singing, the low rate of fire means that even though you have incredible range, you actually have really low secondary DPM, and the average number of fires you can expect to light per minute is considerably lower than average. Though I will say in defense of the Massachusetts secondary array, it does seem noticeably more accurate than the Bismarck's laser light show, though you are still going to miss a lot. When we look at maneuverability, the South Dakotas are about 2 knots slower than the average Tier 7 battleship, which puts it 2.5 knots behind the Iowa, should you ever see one driving forward. The Massachusetts shares that exquisite 710-meter turning circle that the Alabama enjoys, and that is best in class, though her rudder is a little slower at 15.7 rather than 15.4, but still slightly below average. The rudder shift and tight turning circle make both the Alabama and Massachusetts pretty good at dodging torpedoes, and it's also one reason why taking rudder in your second slot is a decent choice, particularly if you want to help your team really push an objective in this ship. Unfortunately, in pushing those objectives, people are more likely to notice you as you are on the higher side of very noticeable. Of course, the range of detectability for Tier 7 battleships is only about 400 meters between the most stealthy and least stealthy, and you just happen to be 100 meters worse than average, by both sea and air. And, to the extent that it matters, a very, very noticeable 14.9 kilometer detectability while firing in smoke. In any case, I don't consider this a serious downside, in spite of it being very detectable. When we come to consumables, we have the American Damage Control module, which gives you a few extra seconds of resistance to new fires or floods. We also have the standard repair party, then you have the option between a fighter, a spotter, and your secondary boost. All 3 of these are viable choices, and depending on what you want to do with the Massachusetts, you will choose different things here. The fighter is going to offer you the best vision option, as well as, at least you can imagine, the best anti-aircraft defense once we have carriers in the game. This is most useful when you're looking to be able to spot over smoke and islands while pushing a cap. If you're also going to hang back further though, it may be useful in dissuading carriers from picking on you or spotting torpedoes that you know are being fired by some DD that happens to be stalking you. The spotter plane is probably best for folks who want to run a brawler or survivability build who don't want to go all in on secondaries, and those who want something to help get the guns under control at least a little. I'm sure it also will be possible for those who like to play accuracy builds, just because for some people you can never be accurate enough. As for the secondary mod, I can't imagine really needing this on anything other than maybe a Dewey build or a hybrid build that doesn't have access to Porcupine, or if you're really worried about hitting destroyers, because the secondary battery's accuracy seems to be about 50% against other battleships if you are running Porcupine, and just a little bit lower on cruisers. I would say this is more or less acceptable, so not really necessary on those type of builds, but it is fun for the memes. And finally, we get to the actual battle. We're going to be on Trident. Tried really hard to keep this review a little bit less lengthy, but obviously as they keep throwing more information at us, with the lovely new armor viewer, it gives me a little more to talk about. So anyway, we're going to go ahead, we're going to start off, we're going to put our commander up on the screen. You can see still fiddling about with Willis Lee here. The thing is, I am, by the time I play this game, basically beside myself where this ship is concerned. A little bit sad that I'm shooting HE here, but essentially what you see is I have switched out some of my stuff that I would be using in a full secondary build for a little bit of accuracy, and this is just for mostly these opening moments of the battle. As you can see, we have a Hipper moving around, and we've also got the Gascon. I choose to go for the Hipper because I have been reliably informed through experience that if something truly horrific is going to happen to any ship, unfortunately going to be a Hipper. And that's just one of those unfortunate things. I mean, it's good for me, but like, I just feel bad for all of the Hipper players that always get deleted in the first minute of the game because that ship just takes catastrophic amounts of damage at range. Here we have an Odin. He's sailing backwards in an effort to confuse his opponents. Obviously, with my shot placement, he has succeeded in that. I thought he was slowing down to maybe consider going forward again, but obviously that is not the case. So we missed those pretty badly. We got a key out there. At this point in my ordinary review routine, I think the key is a lightly armored target, like the Amagi. I am wrong. Wait, I should tell you I'm wrong after I bounce most of my shots. There you go. I'm wrong. In any case, we are going to lightly tap this island to kind of reduce the number of places where incoming torpedoes might catch me. As you can see, we still have a little bit of loving attention from some of the players on the enemy team. We're trying to pick a target that's worth shooting at. The bow of a Tier 7 battleship is generally not a really good place to start putting 16-inch shells. We try the Atago, and there you can see a little bit of what can happen if you don't aim very well, and also if you get a little bit unlucky with your dispersion and aren't invested into accuracy. Now with this Gascon, we're doing a little bit more thinking about our shots. He is actually at a pretty good angle, so we don't get a whole lot out of that, and also we're not playing the full amount of his speed. You can see that our team is starting to collapse already, and that my life is being made terrible by something with lots of little HE shells. I'm going to guess that that is either a Flint or an Atlanta. In any case, moving out here is probably going to put a little more of the island right where I need it right now, which is hopefully right between where I'm at and where that American light cruiser is. There you did see I took a really big hit through the back of my ship, and that is exactly what I'm talking about when I say the back armor on this particular ship, not incredible. And if you're somebody who's looking for a kiting battleship, this isn't probably going to be the ship for you. And I think the shells that were coming in there were probably 16-inch battleship shells, and obviously you can see they did just a ton of damage to me. Now looking at the situation, it looks like our team has everything under control over at sea. This is going to tell me I should go elsewhere. That Gascon's going to die with or without me. The problem is that we have right now a points problem and also a boats problem. And that is that I'm really the only person over here who's able to deal with A. I'm not a great choice to be doing this, but you know, when this is what fate hands you, you just gotta do it. So I turn in towards A. I'm trying to keep this island between me and this Atlanta, hoping that he just stops at some point. Obviously, he's not going to. But I was hoping he would also lose vision. Now, the other thing is you can clearly see with that little triangle on the map that there's definitely a destroyer over here, and that's bad news for me. We aim a little bit farther forward on the Atlanta, expecting that he'll start to accelerate. He does. We probably could have given it a little bit more of a lead, but you can never quite tell when somebody's running engine until they do that to you. In any case, there is the destroyer, and as you see, oh god, the turret traverse. This is the standard 45-second turret traverse, and it is just painfully terrible. Even the 40-second turret traverse of the Alabama would have allowed me to probably swing my gun around fast enough to get my rear turret in on some action there. We're turning back to port here because the Atlanta does have torpedoes. No, he's 5.5 kilometers away from me. He might be wise to the fact that I'm driving towards him and launch them, expecting that I'll just drive into them like some rube. I'm trying to reduce that possibility, even if I do like to be a little oblivious from time to time. Like, at no point did I look at what ships are on the enemy team. And then we get a nice shot in on the Atlanta as he's sailing away. This is actually working out pretty well for me if he wants to continue to angle, because honestly, with as lightly armored as that ship is, I'm going to need as much depth to his hull as possible to actually get some of these shells to do anything but overpen him. Now, on the bright side, you can overpen people to death, and we have proven that again. We are in a desperate place now with the Shiratsuyu behind us, and I'm just trying to speed towards this island as best I can. You can see, again, just the languid sort of turret traverse. It's going to take forever. This is like trying to brawl with an Iron Duke. It's not that bad, but it feels like it if you're used to Tier 7 Battleship. We leave this guy a little bit better this time, and with HE, we do a lot of damage there, but not nearly enough to actually kill him. It looks like his modules managed to take a lot of the hits for him. Now as the Iowa is shooting at us, we just have to hold our breath. Managed to ricochet one or two shells off the front bow. We survive long enough to hit that 5th heal, which is exactly why I run survivability. We've still got HE loaded. It's not ideal, but it is what we have. So we shoot it. It does start a fire on the Iowa, which may be helpful for my team in the long run. That time didn't get quite so lucky with the damage, but at least we didn't have next to 0 hit points. Now my maneuver here has allowed me to lose my spot from the Iowa at least, and just have to worry about the Shiratsuyu, which I expected to be shooting torpedoes. Through that gap I was proven correct, so it was a good thing that I changed my speed. Now we're going to get in close to this island and just hope that he isn't going to come around behind us. Since he can still see me, and he shot through that gap. My guess is he is still through that area, and there you see it. He's actually a long way away from us. We do manage, therefore, to actually get this cap, which is going to help my team if this game goes on long enough. Because honestly, I'm not the type of player who's going to stick around and just die in glorious combat. I will run away if I can win that way. It looks exactly the same on the stats page. We put some terrible shots out there, and somebody else finishes off the Iowa. Obviously, you can see I had launched a spotter plane. The spotter plane, regardless of where it is in the animation, will help your accuracy as long as it's active. Unfortunately, I'm used to using the spotter plane on ships that have sub 30-second reloads. So unless you do something about your reload speed, in this case, you're only going to get one set of shells out there. Probably going to play around with this now that I'm not testing it when I do earn the Massachusetts, but that's what we were doing for today. So in terms of closing thoughts on the Massachusetts, because obviously we are probably going to go ahead and sail on towards victory. I have a little bit of trouble, and obviously you can probably tell that listening to this review, getting behind this ship, because this was a ship that I was really looking forward to from the PC. And the fact of the matter is that the Massachusetts just isn't a very good brawler in Legends, unless you can dedicate a whole commander to it. And a lot of people aren't going to be able to do that. I know I certainly can't. On the other hand, there's nothing really bad about this ship if you're not a crazy person like me who wants to take this ship and just ram it into everyone's face. So if you do want to just play an Iowa that can push, you're going to be a little bit slower, you're going to be a lot better at dodging torpedoes, you're a lot better at taking torpedoes, not that you should count on that, but it's a fine ship to play. It's more or less in the same ballpark, obviously, as her sister ship. That's not surprising. So this is a good opportunity for folks who might have wanted the Alabama but couldn't get it, and for the rest of us who really, really wanted something more out of the Massachusetts secondary array, and also having an actual American brawling battleship, which we didn't really get here. You know, I guess you just gotta live with what it is. So in any case, those are my thoughts on the Massachusetts. Thank you everybody for watching, and as always, I hope to see you on the next one.